All right. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm thrilled for this very last... Wait a minute, I need to restart this. I'm thrilled about the entire academic conference. And I would like to say thanks to my co-organizers, Ayako Yasuda, as well as Pedro Matos and Laura Starks, and of course, the glorious, unstoppable Catherine Ung from PRI. The reason I'm excited about this session is, we've talked about climate risks in investing, we've talked about corporate political engagements, and now we are really moving towards system-level investing. In a sense of, if you think about it, we're in the midst of multiple crises, climate change, biodiversity loss, social inequality, poverty, etc. The typical response is it's the government's role to react and regulate. Yes, theoretically, yes. But whatever they are doing, it's unfortunately not sufficient, because otherwise we would not be in the midst of all these crises. And so this puts the spotlight on the private sector, both the real economy and the financial sector. What can they do and to what extent to help mitigate these system-level challenges? Now, when you think about it, when you look at the ESG practices, sustainable finance, corporate sustainability practices, our theories, I'm talking here about both academia and practice. If you think about our theories, models, frameworks, and practices, our thinking is really confined to the firm level and portfolio level. What do I mean? For example, there is a lot of pressure on you all to divest from fossil fuel industries. But if you really care about addressing climate change, divestment is probably not the most effective way, because all you do is clean up your own portfolio. But it doesn't mean that those portfolio companies you just divested from will change their act, correct? Or if you think about, there are some studies out there that say, oh, don't worry about climate change or biodiversity risk or so. You can just hedge away the risk. Can you? Really? Unfortunately, I don't think we can. What you can is hedge your portfolio risks against climate news in the short term. But it does not take into account the long-term implications of investments for climate change, biodiversity loss, social inequality, etc., nor does it take into account the increasing risks and costs of all these system-level challenges on the investments portfolio's performance, correct? So the underlying assumption of the core theory we are using in finance, called modern portfolio theory, don't ask me why it's called modern, but that's a different question, is that systemic risks are exogenous, not endogenous. So we just assume away the intercorrelation between the systemic risks, system-level challenges, and our investment decisions. The last example I'm going to give is, for example, we had a session on corporate political engagement. When we look at the ESG performance of companies, we hardly ever incorporate the political activity of companies. We look at, for example, environmental performance of companies, the Scope 1 emissions, maybe Scope 2, forget about Scope 3. But we certainly don't consider, do the companies and investors engage with policymakers to trigger systemic change, okay? So this is why I'm excited about this session. We really need to move away from firm level and portfolio level thinking towards a systems-focused approach. And the two studies we'll hear about today are moving into that direction. So the word goes to, may I introduce the first speaker? So we flip the order. Camila Yamahaki will present her work. May I ask you to?
So, hi everyone, good morning. My name is Camila Yamahaki, and I am a researcher in sustainable finance at Getulio Vargas Foundation in São Paulo, Brazil. My name is Japanese because my grandparents are Japanese, but I'm Brazilian. So my colleague and I, Catherine, we did our PhDs on investor engagement with corporations, but we thought that there was this new investor activism and investor, this new investor activism and this new type of investment practice that has been gaining ground in the investment community, which is sovereign engagement or policy engagement, in which investors, they have been engaging to influence public policies on ESG issues. And So we were really interested to try to better understand this phenomenon. We think there was a topic that was worth investigating further, in particular, the drivers of engagement. So why are investors interested in engaging with policymakers and with government representatives on ESG issues? So, the green one. So we, in our research, we found 11 cases of sovereign engagement. Some of them are here. So one of them that you might have heard in some of the sessions in the PRI in person is the Investors Policy Dialogue on Deforestation, which is a group of over 70 investors that have been engaging with the Brazilian and the Indonesian government to reduce the rates of deforestation in these countries. In particular, in Brazil, they are requesting for enforcement of the forest code. They are requesting for protection of the rights of indigenous people, and also to improve access to public data for better traceability of soft commodities in Brazil. In Europe, we have the Shareholders for Change that was engaging with the Namibian government for the country to accede to the UN Biological Weapons Convention, which eventually the country did join, so it was a successful engagement. And we also have the Investor Agenda, a group of investors that have been accelerating, trying to advocate for public policies that help to accelerate the net zero transition. They have been engaging with several countries, for instance, with Australia. So they engage with the Australian Treasurer and the Reserve Bank of Australia to ask for mandatory goals more aligned with the TCFD. So when we look at the literature, we see that very little has been written about sovereign engagement. Most of the studies that we found were about other stakeholders trying to influence public policies, for instance, corporations, the media, churches, and also civil society. And we have also this other strand in the literature that is analyzing investor engagement with corporations. But we only found two pieces of research on sovereign engagement. One was an academic study, and another was a book chapter. One hint that we got from the literature on why investors are engaging with policymakers comes from the universal ownership theory. So as more and more investors are investing across sectors, across different asset classes, and across different markets, so their financial returns are very much linked to the developments of the economy. And so they are interested in the overall health of the economy, and also in minimizing systemic risks, which are risks that affect the whole economy and are risks that might have an impact on their beta performance. So our research questions were two. The first one, what drives institutional investors to engage with sovereign entities on ESG issues? And what are the main challenges that they find in this process? So the methodology, as I mentioned, was 11 cases of engagement initiatives. We analyzed all the documents that were publicly available, such as the reports from these organizations, the reports on the initiatives, and we complemented with some semi-structured interviews with investors and investor associations. And so far, we've conducted 9 of them. We analyze all this contact using the Atlas software based on investor motivations and investor challenges. So in terms of the research findings, as for the main motivations, we found that, first of all, investors, they report that they want to comply with their fiduciary duty. So they have a fiduciary duty to act in the best interest of their beneficiaries. And since some of the rules that govern the financial market are not always aligned with the interests of their beneficiaries, they believe that they have a duty and they have a responsibility to act on behalf of the beneficiaries and try to find further alignment. Related to that is also about managing investment risks. So first of all, they're engaging with policymakers to try to create and to improve rules related to corporate disclosure and corporate transparency to improve comparability and also the comprehensiveness of the reporting, so that they are better able to analyze the risks of the investee companies and also to manage the risks of their portfolios. For sovereign investors, it's about, they believe that the investors that we spoke to, they believe that better governance practice and better social and environmental performance, they are going to improve and lead to better risk-adjusted returns by improving the country's economic outcome. And for equity investors, it's about managing market, reputational, and regulatory risks of the investee companies. So as to give you an example, in Brazil, the Brazilian companies that are in the agricultural sector, they are under increasing scrutiny to improve their deforestation practice, to manage deforestation risks. And so they need better access to public data on land tenure, on commodity traceability, to better manage their risks in their supply chain. And as I mentioned before, there are also the systemic risks that was very much discussed. For instance, climate change, human rights are some of the issues that are considered systemic and that have a potential impact on beta performance. But not only are investors trying to manage investment risks, but it's also about trying to create an enabling environment for sustainable investments. So they report that, for example, they want investors to implement their climate policies because that will allow investors to have more confidence to put their money there for green technologies, green infrastructure, and other green sectors. And so they believe that countries that have implemented the climate policies, they are more attractive investment destinations. And also it's about trying to create a level playing field for companies with good practice to be rewarded, and also for companies that are laggards to be pushed to improve their ESG practice. And finally, for values-based investors, as we talked about, it's about ethical reasons and what they believe is the right thing to do. So some of the main challenges that investors reported in the process, I'm not going to go through all of them because we won't have time, but just to mention a few of them. For instance, limit investor influence toward governments, whereas in corporate engagements, investors, they have significant influence as co-owners in the case of equity ownership, as lenders in the case of bond ownership. But in the case of in governments, they're just one of the many stakeholders that are trying to influence public policy, and so they don't have such a strong voice. There is also the need for capacity building on both worlds. So on the side of the government, there's a need for investors to understand why ESG issues are considered investment and material risks, and also the side of the investors to better understand how the public policy making works in the target countries. There's also a question of cultural differences. So, for instance, in countries that are have as they part of their culture relationship building before the start of any negotiations, we see that having naming and shaming strategies, for instance, sending public letters, might be counterproductive to the starting of the dialogue and to the success of the engagement. And the possibility also that investors may be blamed for interfering with national sovereignty, especially foreign investors that are engaging with governments in other countries. And one investor also mentioned that maybe bringing some of the domestic investors to the coalition might be something that might help to improve this legitimacy and to bring more investor voice to the coalition. So just to wrap up, it's still exploratory, but I hope that helps to fill a gap in the literature by identifying these new stakeholders, a new stakeholder that has been trying to influence public policies on ESG issues, and also to hopefully to offer some insights on governments, on the demands of the investment community, and how they can further attract private investments to achieve their climate and sustainability commitments. So thank you very much. And I hope I'm open for any questions that you may have, and also for suggestions on how I can improve my paper. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Camila. And allow me to introduce the academic discussant, Naoko Ishii.
Very good morning to everyone. My name is Naoko Ishii, currently at University of Tokyo. I was introduced as an academia, discussant from academia. I have to say, I have 40 years of career working for either national government as well as an international servant. So, and I'm only 3 years old at academia. So my comments are mostly, I hope it's kind of a mix of both things, but maybe more on the practitioner side.
It was meant as a compliment.
Well, first, I really would like to congratulate the organizer of this session, because the title, the theme of this session is so intriguing. It's how to change, or why we need to change the rule of the game. That's so needed. And as Caroline already mentioned, that what we are facing, either climate change, the nature loss, or the inequality, is basically system clash, that our current economic and social system collide with the planetary Earth system. So that's why we see so much of the friction of those kind of either natural disaster or social disaster. And now we are really going beyond the tipping points of planetary boundaries. Now that very recently, that Johan Rockström and his group is basically saying 6 out of 9 planetary boundaries we have already transgressed, and we have maybe only a few years to really bring us back to that safe and safe and just operating. So that's where we are, and that's why the system change is needed, and that's why we need to find a way to change the rule of the game. And so I'm so happy to be actually invited to this session, and then the paper is great, and I just want to make a few comments. As the moderator mentioned, as Caroline also Camila also suggested, what we are really trying to see that how the investor community can really catalyze the system change. And then here I would say that I think that there is also the mentioning that the government is not a government role, and to what extent investors can do it. But based on my 40 years of public sector experience, I have much more natural hope or strong hope of the private sector and the investors can create this movement. And it should be really the multi-stakeholder coalition or co-creation. It's not only government, it's not only the private sector, which does include the investors. But I think this when we think about the pressure point, where we can really change that or catalyze the change, I do really have a very strong the hope that investors can do a lot to create this system change. Then I just want to mention a few things about the outcome of the research, and she identified a few of the motivations of the investors, that among them, I was so happy to see that one of the motivations is how to create the level playing field. Because in order to catalyze the system change, it's definitely needed to penalize the bad deeds and reward the good deeds. And then if the investors can really come up with the kind of creating the level playing field, that will really trigger the much needed system change. So I was very happy to see it. Another thing I was so interested in seeing is that the need of a capacity or capability building of investors side, but as well as the government side, being the government or international system for 40 years, I really think that the need for the capacity building is so important. And when I do now a little bit about the academic side, that when we try to identify which country, which society are really up to the system change, one of the results is the capability to innovate, that the capacity of the institutions, and that is definitely one trigger of the successful system change. So congratulations of that result, and I'm very, very happy about it. Maybe that another thing which I found maybe slightly different the take from the conclusion or the outcome is that one of the outcomes said that somebody maybe interviewed see that the influence of the investors are limited in terms of policy change. I do have a very different feel about it now. Now that sitting in Japan and seeing that the series of annual shareholder management, the meeting, and who are really calling the shot, who those and the companies are really worried about and afraid of, is the voice of the international investors, active or activist investors. I see clear potential of the influence and on from those investors. And then Camila also mentioned the deforestation issue, but the upcoming TCFD, actually TNFD, also showed that the need for the valuing the nature and listening to the voices of the investors. So there is quite a number of examples that the investors' voice have already triggered a lot of potential of the system change. My last comment is about what in the future, where we really want to see that the more of the investors' influence in terms of changing the rule of the game for system change. Quickly, two things. That the decarbonization pathway to net zero, that currently the most of the taxonomy, the pathway is still kind of coming from the Western world, but the net zero pathway will be very different from the Western world, I would say, maybe European condition, and some of the global South, or some of the Asian condition. So we all understand and agree that we need to get the path the net zero by 2050, but the pathway may be very different. Then related taxonomy is also should be different, and it's very important to identify the right path that flow to the transition, the finance. So that's one area that the academia or investors co-create a kind of new rule. Then as I already mentioned, valuing the natural capital, which is also part of that the finding, is exceedingly important because right now we have a lot of methods to measure carbon, but we don't have much method to value the natural capital, and that's going to be the next area of that not only research but the co-creation, the co-action that with the investors community as well as the policymakers and academia. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Naoko. And next online is Jason Mitchell from the Man Group.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. Again, I'm Jason Mitchell, Head of Responsible Investment Research at Man Group and Chair of UK SIF. So thank you for the invitation, and thank you, Camila, for the paper. I found it really interesting, and I guess I want to make a few points and then open it up to a few questions where I think you can develop it, because I think this needs to be developed as just a theme, not a paper, because it's so important. And I say important because first you make the point that returns are very aligned in terms of this kind of macro perspective. And the fact is, it's true. Returns are predominantly driven at the strategic asset allocation level for funds, not at that underlying corporate level attribution, which I think reinforces the argument for policy engagement from investors. I think secondly, I like the idea of entering this through the universal ownership theory, but I think we have to acknowledge the fact that many pension funds, particularly state pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, are constrained in terms of engaging. What I'd love to see, and this is probably a bit idealistic, but the winning paper from yesterday was the GPIF's experiment over a 2-year basis to try and drive stewardship outcomes at a passive ETF level. And I'd love to try and see or figure out a way to kind of replicate that at a policy level. In terms of the comments I've got, I think one thing that the paper does is sort of treat the idea of fiduciary duty as sort of singular and finished or complete. And the last thing I want to do is try and relitigate fiduciary duty, particularly at this conference, and I will not. But it is in flux. It's being debated. Case in point, in the UK, the House of Lords is thinking about redefining it within the Financial Services and Markets Bill just last summer, and it's gotten pushed out. And I guess I bring this up because it's talked about as a driver, but I wonder if it's as well a challenge in the sense that I'm going to go to, like, one of the case studies is the Investor Agenda's global investor statement to governments on the climate crisis. And you use the 2022 letter, which had 602 signatories of about 42 trillion, which is interesting on 2022, but that compares to 2021 of 733 signatories of 52 trillion. So I think obviously AUM in the ESG space in 2022 was down, but it's interesting to see a 20% decrease in the signatories for that letter. And within that 2022 letter, it's different from prior letters because there are two different usages of fiduciary duty. One is called investors are taking action, as it's not only permitted by law, but is in many cases required to ensure their ability to generate returns in the long term as a core fiduciary duty and benefit from the opportunities associated with the shift to a net zero economy. So that's the first instance. The second instance is robust climate action is being driven by our need to decrease our exposure to climate risk as a core fiduciary duty and by the potential opportunities associated with the transition to a net zero emissions economy. And I think speaking to folk in the US on the legal side, I think there's a real distinction between that. You'd agree? And I think that has directly driven a defection by large US managers. So I think my point being that fiduciary duty is as much a challenge as it is a driver. And particularly among letters like that where you're talking about a coalition of 7 investor initiatives trying to sort of come together for around one definition. I think in terms of questions, what about parastatal companies? I think you talk about 11 great case studies, but I think the paper could benefit from a better understanding of maybe parastatal case studies. Obviously, these state-owned companies have some form of political power. From my own experience, and we led a shareholder resolution against J-Power recently that was inextricably tied to energy security within Japan. I think a couple other questions because I'm running out of time. But to what degree do electoral cycles and electoral volatility play a factor in this? I think it's sort of interesting when you think about in the US, you look at something like the Clean Power Plan and the fact that Obama instituted it, it was reneged by Trump and then put into place. How does that introduce sort of volatility to engagement opportunities by investors? The UK is a great example with the U-turn by Rishi Sunak. And in fact, only, I think yesterday or the day before, where we've actually seen a retirement of the Green Taxonomy Advisory Group. And I think I would say 2 other points. One, is there a toolbox for policy engagement at the sovereign level? We've seen that for corporates, particularly around equities and how you escalate that. We've seen that on the credit side. But what does that look like in terms of sovereigns? And I think the last thing is this idea of materiality. Because in some of these case studies, some are clearly, in fact, you write, investors are found to engage with policymakers to manage ESG risks that they deem financially material. But there are some case studies. For instance, I'm looking at the Catholic investors engaging in Brazil on deforestation, and that would have a clear economic impact on Brazil. But there's also an engagement around indigenous peoples. And so that's more of a social impact. So is there sort of a framework for materiality? But no, great. I like the paper, and I'd love to see more work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me give a chance to respond. Camila, would you like to respond or just...
No, I'm just going to talk about the social issues, for example, because also the IPDD, who's a group of more mainstream investors, differently from the Catholic investors, they are also targeting the rights of indigenous people in their engagement. And I asked to one of the investors involved in the coalition, and they said that they also consider that a material issue for investors that also have my impact also valuation of sovereign bonds. So because for me it was also a bit surprising, because I didn't think that had a direct link to materiality. And also for fiduciary duty, I think it's also considered a question of context. I didn't have the opportunity to, I think I only interviewed one American investor. Maybe if I had interviewed more, I would have heard more about that as a challenge rather than a driver, as I heard from the European investors.
So for all the American investors in this room, she would love to talk to you after a presentation.
Yeah, by the way, I would love to, if you are involved in policy engagement, and I would love to interview you for my research. Thank you.
Excellent, and we'll show the email of her afterwards again. All right, so let's move to the next paper. So we are short on one discussant. That's the bad news. The good news is it might actually allow us to magically have a couple of minutes for Q&A. So there's always a positive side to it. So let's see what happens towards the end of the session. In the meantime, Madison Condon from Boston University, you're up.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you, Carolyn. Thanks to the other panelists. Okay, institutional investor industrial policy. So I wrote this paper called Externalities and the Common Owner a few years ago. It's basically the universal owner argument. I argued that institutional investors have a financial interest to reduce the systemic risk across their portfolio. I pointed specifically to climate change. And I put forward this cost-benefit analysis in which, hypothetically, if a bunch of institutional investors, BlackRock and Vanguard, for example, forced Exxon and Chevron to not bring a substantial amount of their claim reserves to surface, would it sort of like satisfy the cost-benefit analysis of the mitigated damages to the portfolio in the future from the present-day profits sacrificed today? The cost-benefit analysis worked out. It raised potential legal dilemmas, namely antitrust and fiduciary duties, for both boards, corporate boards, and fund managers. And so the fallout from this paper has been, there's been a great debate. There's been many, many papers written from sort of like the leading corporate law luminaries in the US saying that this paper is wrong. So part of what I'm trying to do in this next project is defend this paper. And also, like, it's really interestingly observable that everyone at this conference is going around saying that they're a universal owner mitigating systematic risk, whereas the legal experts in the US are very skeptical that that is literally a thing that is allowed. So I'm just highlighting that. Rick Alexander is shaking his head. So after I wrote this paper, Jeffrey Gordon sort of doubled down on the systemic stewardship aspect of the argument, and it was embraced by the UN Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, saying, yes, we agree with Madison Condon and Jeffrey Gordon. We have a mandate to mitigate systematic risk. So the critics of this universal owner framing, there's a bunch of critiques. I'm not going to be able to address all of them. I'll just mention some. One is that the economics of emissions reductions simply don't work out, that the cost-benefit analysis I put forward is bad. The second is that it's illegal for corporate boards and or investors to do this, either because it's anti-competitive behavior or they're violating their fiduciary duties. And the third argument is agency cost, that like even if everybody wanted to do this, they wouldn't be able to do it because actually asset managers, the BlackRocks of the world, they make their money through selling the product. They don't actually make money through making the portfolio bigger. So they themselves as managers don't have the incentive to do it. And there's potential conflicts of interest potentially if BlackRock does want to maximize a portfolio, but it has a bunch of different underlying beneficial investors that don't necessarily have the same diversified mix as BlackRock. There's potentially some like conflicts of interest there. So this is all moving ahead. All of these challenges are not simply academic, is what I'm trying to say. So these issues about antitrust and fiduciary duties are being used in the media very frequently. I really encourage you to Google Denise Hearn, who's sitting right there, and her report from Columbia, because I won't have time to go into the antitrust issues. I would say the summary is that this is a real theoretical problem. It's not clear to me that there's really a winning case here. And I think that those are two really big distinctions, meaning like it's having a chilling effect in ways that I'm not sure it really should. It is very hard to prove that you have taken an anti-competitive action based on like what the law requires to bring that type of case. Nevertheless, our like theories of how investing should work are still like sort of complicated at this very moment. They have not been resolved about like how we think antitrust should fit into our conception of corporate law. So critics to my argument about universal ownership say, actually, the reason why firms are doing this, the reason why BlackRock encourages disclosure, the reason why the big institutionals supported, for example, the hedge fund fight against Exxon, engine number one, is for a single firm-specific focus. Like they just wanted to maximize Exxon's returns. This was not about BlackRock's portfolio. This was an Exxon-specific maximizing purpose. So the point of this paper, this next project of mine, is really to try to say, it is very impossible or very hard to the point of being like silly to try to double down on this question, even though it does matter legally, whether a certain action was for the portfolio or for a firm. And so I'm trying to push on this and say it's really hard to answer what like to go or not go net zero. It really depends on what everybody else around you is doing in the economy. If everyone else around you switches to hydrogen, it is no longer in your interest to keep doubling down on oil and gas. So I'm trying to highlight the like systemic nature of investing like naturally anyway. You like automatically look to what the other firms are doing in your portfolio. The Securities and Exchange Commission actually cited me for this idea in its climate disclosure rule. And this has really pissed off Republicans. This idea that like you would require a corporation to disclose information that the investor would use not for investing in that firm, but for understanding of the other firms in the portfolio. To me, it's sort of obvious that this has always been, like you always are looking at the firm's competitors to see whether this firm is going to do better versus the competitor. You use a bunch of different firms' disclosures to understand that firm. So I'm trying to like emphasize the like necessarily like systemic nature in the first place. So I'm trying to say what we can actually do. We can observe these institutional investors doing elaborate cross-sectoral engagement. Like I put forward this hypothetical CBA about Exxon sitting on a bunch of oil and gas, but that's not really like a realistic representation of how investors do engagement. And if you can actually observe what investors are doing, they're becoming much more sophisticated about understanding how the economy is going to look in the future. And that requires understanding how different sectors of the economy interact with other sectors of the economy. So they're doing elaborate engagement, both up and down supply chains, with a recent focus on the hardest to abate industries. So I'm going to skip this. I just want to emphasize that the cost to do a cost-benefit analysis for climate damages is just you're starting out to do a silly thing that like you shouldn't try to do long-term discounting of climate damages. The Nordhaus-Dice model is the Nobel Prize-winning economic model, and models like this, integrated assessment models, are very widely used across the financial sector. I don't have time to summarize why they're wrong. If you want to Google me, why I'm mad at economists, Madison Condon, I wrote a blog post that tries to explain in like the most accessible detail why these very widespread integrated assessment models are not good for investing, even though they're being used by the NGFS and by the Federal Reserve. Next slide. These scenarios are much better ways of like understanding how, like whether or not you are on the path to reaching net zero or not. And emissions is no longer the best proxy for doing this. Like investors are, the most sophisticated investors are increasingly moving to actual like capital allocation plans, very like specific year-to-year investments in long-term physical assets that are going to have lifetimes. I mean, so like emissions today don't necessarily correlate to what emissions tomorrow are if you're investing a ton of like upfront capital right now in a big hydrogen facility. It's much more interesting to assess transition risk on like a technology specific basis than an emissions basis today. So these scenarios really help in assessing those types of risks. They're getting very specific. Investors and like the institutions that support them are building these very detailed bottom-up scenarios of like what different industries would have to do in order to decarbonize. They can be top-down like the IEA, but they can be matched with these bottom-up models of like literally where all of the aluminum companies are and what all of the aluminum companies would have to do to decarbonize. And they're getting very granular and very specific. I'm going to skip this. Skip this. Here's another example of like how detailed these different scenarios are becoming. These cross-industry collaborations are not coming just from the investor side. They're also coming from the corporates where there's this first movers coalition where John Kerry has marshaled a bunch of different corporates to agree to things that sound a little fiscally antitrust, a little fiscally anti-competitive. And I would say that these raise my eyebrows like much more than the institutional investor engagements, meaning like they're specifically making price contracting agreements with one another to buy green products at a premium, like for the specific stated purpose of lowering the price, like for the benefit of the economy. Strange. I'm gonna skip this. I skip this. There are limits to this systemic stewardship approach. So one thing I just wanted to point out, so right after the invasion of Ukraine, obviously there was like a big upset in the ESG investing world. And Mark Carney said, actually, we understand now that resilience requires more stranded assets in the medium term in order to in order to be resilient in the longer term. I just want to double down on like, what does Mark Carney like possibly mean? Like the definition of a stranded asset is that you thought it would be profitable and then it turns out not to be profitable. So how can Mark Carney like tell all the investors to like willingly accept more stranded assets when the definition is you think it's going to be profitable? Compare that to how China is like at this moment building a lot of coal-fired plants, which it seems to be planning on retiring as it also brings online renewables. As a state planner, it can do that. It can plan to not reap like all of the profits from these expected long-term lives of the coal plants. So this is just like one limitation of like what the private sector systemic perspective can possibly achieve. I'm going to skip the agency costs and the voting. All right, this is my conclusion, and I'll try to summarize the conclusion because the slide's a little bit chaotic. The reason why the first paper was called Externalities in the Common Owner is because I was looking at the common ownership literature, which is a bunch of different empirical studies saying that like, oh, as BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street start to own the entire economy and they own all the players in a certain industry, there's some empirical papers that allege to find that these industries start to behave more anti-competitively. So one of the original authors of one of the first papers was in the airline industry. This is Martin Schmaltz. He and Jose Azar and a couple other co-authors found that like the American airline industry behaves more anti-competitively as they are owned by this larger share of like they have larger common ownership shares. He's right here critiquing Jeff Gordon's argument that you can do systemic stewardship without hurting anybody, that there's no losers. You're like not forcing a corporate firm to sacrifice its own profits. Everyone can benefit. There's no antitrust problems. So what I'm trying to do to make sense of Jeff Gordon's conclusion is to say, well, if antitrust law only cares about consumer welfare, which at this moment it does, then if you're systemically, you're not just like pressuring Exxon to not bring oil to the surface, you're pressuring Exxon to not bring oil to the surface simultaneously as you're encouraging everyone else to lose less oil. And so these like sector-wide sectoral engagements, and where you're like trying to merge all the systems of the economy simultaneously together so that you don't impact consumer price and that you don't have these shocks that like limit the policy acceptance of your intervention.
Thank you. Excellent. Thank you very much, Madison. I forgot that you're a legal scholar. You like to talk? No. Okay. Next up, Linda-Eling Lee from MSCI. Thanks so much, Linda.
Thank you. All right, well, thank you. It's a very interesting paper, very important topic. So the paper actually sets up a really nice articulation of the rationale for universal owners to engage on a systemic risk like climate change that threatens the overall economy and market-wide returns. And then after that, there are just lots of things going on, okay, in this paper, as you can tell. And so, I found it quite challenging to get through, partly because it's not very long. However, it has a lot of different strands of arguments. And so to try to figure out kind of what are the areas that will be the most relevant for investors from the point of view of practitioners, a practitioner discussant, I did find it challenging, but I found it really a great opportunity to really engage with the idea that there are these major critiques on the universal ownership thesis that I think that most people here actually just kind of take for granted. And so I think that, from what I gathered, I think there were sort of two main critiques to this kind of portfolio primacy view or this kind of multi-firm engagement view. So the first critique, I think, is something that I really wanted to think about kind of more objectively, which is that it raises the question of even if you believed in it and you actually think that the theory really works, how effective is it actually in implementation? Because you have issues like, emissions leakage, or you just have limited scope of influence as universal owners. And so, I'm not sold on either side, but I thought I'd offer a little bit of context setting in terms of just data points on both sides to advance the discussion. So if we were to just look at the public equities universe, the MSCI ACWI Index has about 9,000 public companies that account for over 99% of the global market cap. And so we estimate that the emissions from those companies contribute to about a fifth of global GHG emissions. So share owners of the world own about 20% of the global emissions through their equity holdings of public companies. And so through MSCI's Net Zero Tracker, this is a report that we publish quarterly, what we've seen is that the number of companies that have been declaring net zero targets has actually tripled over the last 3 years to about 30%. So theoretically, you still have a ton of companies that can actually commit to a net zero trajectory. However, these companies are not created equal. Some of them are definitely more influenceable than others. And so I think it's really important to look at the ownership structure. So 9% of publicly listed companies in this set are actually state-owned. And so theoretically, it just makes them less susceptible to private finance shareholder pressure. And then there's a whole other set, 71% of additional companies may also be somewhat insulated from shareholder pressure because they either have a principal owner that owns at least 10% of the shares, or they're what we would call the controlled companies, which has a single shareholder that owns more than 30% of the shares. So that really means that only about 20% of the world's listed companies are what we would be categorizing as widely held companies that theoretically are the most responsive to shareholder engagement on an issue, for example, on climate change. And in fact, we have seen that ownership structure really matters quite a lot because among these widely held companies, the most influenceable set, almost 70% of them already have set some sort of a decarbonization target. Okay, so that's like 3 times the prevalence compared to the companies that has a controlling shareholder. So this lopsidedness might be accounted for by the fact that on the Climate Action 100 Plus focus list, 40% of the companies on that list are actually widely held, even though, in terms of the representation on the listed markets, they're really only 20%, of the companies. So, investors obviously are picking the ones that are the most influenceable, and they are actually getting, some of the outcomes that they want to see. So far, I think in terms of the data I'm offering, I'm sounding a little bit skeptical about just how much systemic engagement can actually change world emissions, because what we really have is about 20% of companies in a total set that accounts for 20% of the world emissions, and they're shouldering like the bulk of the engagements and doing the disproportionate amount of the decarbonization commitments as well as the actual decarbonization. Now, as I said, I hadn't really made up my mind, so I wanted to kind of offer data points on both sides. And so on the other side, I would suggest that there is actually much more than probably meets the eye in terms of what's actually beyond this 20% of the most influenceable companies. So the first step would be the state-owned companies. So they're not actually probably as unresponsive, and they're not as lagging as we might assume. So we know from over 30,000 interactions with issuers that we have every year at MSCI on their on issuers' ESG data and scores that national firms are actually kind of sensitive and prickly about their reputation and their ranking within an industry. So the fact that they really actually care about how they rank on their industries has actually has kind of manifested in the fact that a higher percentage of state-owned entities in the set actually have set net zero targets compared to companies that actually has a controlling non-state shareholder. So they're not really as lagging or uninfluenceable as maybe the theory might propose. And then the second would be around private assets. Okay, so there has been a concern and ongoing debate that public companies would actually offload their dirty assets to private equity funds that in order to avoid scrutiny. And no one knows for sure because the data is not very, it's not there at the moment, but at least like the preliminary snapshot doesn't indicate that this is the case. And I think that if it were the case, we're going to find out pretty soon because there's transparency is definitely coming for the private companies. So Burgess is a company that MSCI just acquired, which has the world's largest database, I think, on private assets. It has 13,000 funds, infrastructure, real estate, private equity, and private credit funds. And so when we did just an initial kind of footprinting estimate for 4,000 funds covering about 18,000 companies, we just didn't find that the funds were much more emissions intensive. And now there's a lot of industry effort to actually collect data from private companies directly. And so even if there were emissions migration from the public universe to the private universe, I think that this coming transparency would actually disincentivize at least this migration. And then finally, I think that in some of the other sessions too, bringing in scope 3 now into the reporting and target setting does actually further, is going to have knock-on effects from Universal's owners' engagement with public companies, because public companies attempting to decarbonize their value chain will actually bring this very long tail, I think, of small private companies into the net, many of which are actually in emerging markets. So that really kind of gets you beyond the initial set that we were talking about. So I do see evidence on both sides in terms of how much, even if you bought into this whole theory, how much engagement from universal owners can actually, in fact, impact economy-wide decarbonization. So I think that from the paper, I obviously extracted that the second critique is around the legal challenges of and the murkiness around kind of collaborative engagement. I am not a lawyer. I have lawyers at our firm that would not probably want me to talk about anti-competitiveness and sustainable finance. So I'm just make two observations on this on the kind of the more collective engagement point of view. So first is that if the core rationale for using a collaborative engagement is to actually conserve resources so that you're kind of trying to avoid duplication across asset owners, and then also to communicate a common and then clear set of demands for companies so that they're all shooting for the same thing and not getting kind of multiple demands, then I do think that the two examples that have been given of the GPIF indexes that have been discussed in yesterday as well as I think today's sessions, both the ESG index, but also the WIN index, which is the MSCI Japan Women's Leadership Index, is actually quite interesting. I think in the ESG report, you can actually see the reported changes. And then another example I would just point people to would be the New Zealand Superannuation Fund, which has moved their entire equity portfolio to a Paris-aligned benchmark. And so I think when you have built in an improvement factor for companies, it does at least serve the communications effect of it, allowing companies to know what it is clearly that asset owners are expecting of the companies. And then wrapping up with, I think, one last observation, which is that, when we look at the collective carbon budget of the world's listed companies, just based on kind of their sectors and where they and where they're located, we know that when we extrapolate their commitments forward, and they're actually right now on a temperature path that is just slightly cooler than the path that the world is on. Which seems like good news because that is kind of the goal of all this engagement. But it also kind of defies logic in that the world's largest companies would actually be able to run like too much ahead of the decarbonization of the energy systems they're actually enmeshed in the markets where they operate. So I think that what that implies is that universal owners should actually be engaging governments on policy to accelerate decarbonization of the energy system just as much as they do prioritizing engagement of the actual portfolio companies. And instead, what I worry a little bit about, especially in terms of the different forums where like this week at PRI, but others as well, is that when we see investors or financial institutions, talking to policymakers or regulators, they seem to be primarily focusing or advocating on financial regulations or rules around sustainable finance. And that would be in contrast to the portfolio companies that they're engaging in the energy sector, in the hard-to-abate sectors, where I think those companies' lobbying efforts are probably likely targeting policies that impact their operations and their actual real economy emissions. So there seems to be, I think, a mismatch or potential mismatch or a gap between, what investors are doing in terms of their policy advocacy and what their portfolio companies are actually doing. So I'm going to end there. I hope I've offered at least some sort of questions that will prompt further research in this area. I do think this is an important topic, and I look forward to seeing more research.
Thanks so much, Linda. Let me give a chance to Madison to respond for a second.
Yeah, I'm just thank you so much. I thought those were all really good comments. I'm not going to respond in full other than to underline your last statement about like the biggest impact an investor can have is to, first of all, like in part get out of the way. Some of the information about even the anti-climate lobbying that's still going on is like very frustrating. And it feels like investors are speaking out of two sides of their mouth. So I agree with you.
All right, let me open it up. First of all, thanks so much to everyone for writing the studies, for doing the studies, I should say, not just writing them, but also for the very valuable discussions. May I open it up for questions, comments, suggestions? Kelly. And if you don't mind to state your name and affiliation.
Kelly Shu, Yale University. So I was just thinking that for a small investor or a small fund manager, the incentives aren't really aligned to engage in costly engagement because the benefit of that engagement in terms of lowering system level, let's say climate risk, is then that benefits everybody, whereas I have to put in my personal effort, right? So there seems to be probably a massive free rider problem here that would actually push for ironically, another type of antitrust issue, which is the way to get around this free rider problem is for BlackRock to get even bigger, right? Because then BlackRock would have the incentive to really try to lower system level risk, or for investors basically to unite to the level of the Chinese government has the incentive then to regulate the entire country. So I'm just wondering how would you feel about potentially massive consolidation in these responsible investment funds to possibly make them have incentives that are more aligned?
So I sort of disagree. So I sort of think these scenarios and these like very transparent public sectoral scenario building, like CA 100 plus and GFANs, for example, those are solving to me some of the incentive problems. Like those are public goods in some way. Like all the investors are putting some amount of resources into them, but everyone gets to use them and understand that like the vision for the aluminum industry is this vision. You can defect, certainly, but it's not clear to me that the incentives of like engagement, even California CA 100 plus, like they very explicitly tasked certain investors with handling certain companies in certain regions, like on behalf of the consortium. That might seem, so one thing then I'll close. I really like the way Denise yesterday said that, like, it's not an antitrust violation if it just, like, feels fishy. And I agree, it feels fishy and weird, and that's not, like, the way we think of how markets work. It's not clear that that is a winnable legal argument at all. We should think more about the fishiness, but it's not clear to me that that is an antitrust violation. Yeah.
Can I just make one comment? So I think that your example, I mean, to me, that is not a universal owner. So what we're talking about here is not every investor is a universal owner, right? So
is one investor thinking that I'm willing to lower the value of my energy company to maximize some other part of my portfolio, right? Or the overall value of my portfolio.
well, typically, I mean, I don't know how you would define it, but I think they have to be really quite large investors that actually own a slice of the world, right? And quite diversified portfolios. I mean, that is, I think, my understanding.
Totally. I think Rick is shaking his head. I think no one wants to, like, accept the version of universal ownership in which you are hurting one company for the benefit of your whole portfolio. Maybe that is what a universal owner is. I think some people want it both ways, where it's like this systematic risk benefits everyone in this way and no one has to harm. That's a little bit what I'm trying to say with my paper, is like, actually, if we move everybody forward at once, like, Exxon and all the carbon companies, all the oil companies are getting really into carbon capture. Like, it's not clear to me that measuring this stuff at the firm level makes sense at all. Yeah.
Let me give to one more person a chance. I know we are totally out of time. I'm living way too long in the US. I'm no longer Swiss, so to speak, but let's just open up for one more question.
Thank you very much. Patrick Parra with the UN Asset Owner Alliance. I lead the engagement activities. Thank you for sourcing our paper. I think it was a good thing. Sorry that we said Gordon instead of you. We need to look back again. What should we write on next? Any of you, but also you really caught my attention, Madison.
Oh my God. Anyone have? Yeah, anyone can answer.
I don't know. I think that some of my future research, for my future research studies, I want to also look at the side of the government. So we were only looking at the investor perspective, but as Professor Naoko mentioned, also the governments, they think that foreign investors do have a strong voice, an active, strong voice. And so I want to hear more about it.
I love for you to write on that, and also would look forward to hearing what you would like us to write on.
I guess I'd throw out Tom Gosling at London Business School had this idea, I think mid last year, was this idea that investors are on a collision course with their fiduciary duty and net zero commitments. And I'd love to see that more developed. But the idea being that as governments maybe pull away from their commitments, the UK is a great example in terms of the you turn around net zero, you open up that pathway gap, which forces investors who've made that net zero commitment to say, do I double down at risk of my fiduciary duty to sort of remain at 1.5 aligned?
So I think Tom Gosling at ECGI, correct?
Yes. And
Okay.
All right. Can I jump in with a request for what we would really, really like to see and what might unlock some of all of
And just to introduce yourself, I think you were running the panel yesterday on system level investing.
Yeah. So Sheila Perez da Costa, the Stewardship Centre, Sydney, blah, blah. One of the things that you said right at the end, Madison, the two sides, investors speaking with the two sides of out of their two sides of their mouths. I think it's not always, they're not always aware of that. It's often different parts of a particular investor. But I'd love to see some academic research that looked at the ways that investors are influencing the system in the wrong direction, even inadvertently, through that kind of depth of their supply chain, their industry groups, etc. Such that we could rectify that before we have to have like polite conversations with governments and start that whole process from like a beginner level.
Can I just add something?
Last one, and I'm going to finish up.
No, I think what Jason said, actually reminded me from Madison's paper. I think that it's really important for everybody in here is using climate scenario analysis in some way. But this distinction between these normative scenarios versus descriptive scenarios is actually extremely important, as you're doing this exercise, because I do think that as countries, let's say, renege and or change their net zero commitments or their trajectories, you are going to have this kind of widening between what you actually think is the normative scenario versus, well, what's actually going to happen, right?
All right. Thanks so much for the very engaged conversation. I would encourage you to continue that conversation and email us if you have any questions, suggestions, etc. Thank you so much. Thank you. And last but not least, probably by now you've seen these slides already. Please join our academic network. Just scan that nice little code here and let us know about your interest in responsible investing. Next slide, and please join us for the seminar series throughout the year. We have exciting studies being presented, and we would love to bridge the gap between academia and practice. Thanks so much, and I love seeing a next session on system level investing.
Oh, dude, it's